Hello, everyone. Tonight, we're heading into the streets of Los Angeles, where the glow of neon signs mixes with the smell of asphalt after a hot summer day. The air is restless, carrying the sound of car stereos, arguments on front porches, and the occasional siren in the distance. It feels like the kind of night where you'd want to keep your windows closed, where shadows stretch longer than they should, and where you'd swear someone's watching even when you're alone. You've seen crime stories before, but the one I'm about to tell you, let's be real, if you were living in this neighborhood back then, you probably wouldn't survive this. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. Now, turn off the lights and let's enjoy the ride tonight. Lonnie David Franklin Jr. wasn't born into the legend that would later surround him. He started life in South Central Los Angeles in the 1950s, long before the neighborhood became shorthand for crime, poverty, and gang wars. Back then, it was still a working-class area, struggling but alive, a place where families moved in with hopes of building a future. Franklin was one of those kids who grew up with very little, and that scarcity shaped him in ways nobody could have predicted. His childhood was not one that drew much attention. He wasn't the boy setting fires or torturing animals in broad daylight, the kind of cliché backstory you hear in horror documentaries. Instead, he seemed almost invisible. Neighbors remembered him as quiet, sometimes standoffish, but not immediately threatening. He did okay in school, drifted from one odd job to another, and found his way into the U.S. Army as a young man. That's where the first cracks in the surface appeared. The Army sent him overseas, and while most soldiers came back with stories of discipline, camaraderie, or simply relief, Franklin returned carrying darker baggage. In Germany, he was linked to crimes that didn't make national headlines, but hinted at what was to come. A woman reported being lured into his car and attacked in a manner disturbingly similar to the methods he would later use in Los Angeles. Although authorities handled the situation, Franklin avoided long-term consequences. He returned home not with a criminal record that shouted danger, but with the subtle stain of someone who knew how to get away with things. South Central LA in the 1970s and early 1980s was fertile ground for someone like Franklin. The city was already fraying under the weight of economic decline, the rise of gang culture, and a crack cocaine epidemic about to explode. In that storm, Franklin blended right in. He worked as a mechanic, fixing cars and tinkering with appliances. To his friends, he was helpful, maybe even generous, someone you could call if your stereo broke or your engine failed. To his family, he was a father and a husband. Not perfect, but steady enough. That's the trick with predators like him. They aren't lurking in alleys with glowing red eyes. They're standing in line at the grocery store behind you, nodding politely, making small talk about the price of bread. Franklin had perfected the mask of the ordinary man, but beneath that calm exterior, something darker simmered. He collected photographs of women, hundreds of them, many in vulnerable positions, some clearly unaware they were being photographed at all. He spent nights cruising through neighborhoods where desperation was visible on every corner, where sex workers stood under flickering streetlights, where addicts traded dignity for survival. Franklin found in those streets a hunting ground, and slowly, silently, he sharpened his appetite. The social atmosphere gave him cover. Police at the time were overwhelmed with homicides, many connected to drugs and gangs. Victims from marginalized communities, especially black women in South Central, often received little attention. For Franklin, this meant that when he eventually crossed the line from voyeur to killer, he would be stepping into a void where law enforcement barely noticed. His early years didn't scream serial killer, but they whispered it if you listen closely. The German assault case, the hidden stash of photographs, the way he positioned himself as helpful and harmless in daylight, while prowling at night, it all painted a picture of someone who was learning how to hide, how to control, and how to choose victims who, in the cruelest way possible, the system had already forgotten. It's unsettling to think how ordinary he looked to the people around him. Picture it. He's at a barbecue with friends, sipping a beer, cracking a joke about the Dodgers' chances that season. And then later that night, he's cruising down Florence Avenue, searching for someone who wouldn't make the news if she disappeared. That duality, the neighbor you wave to and the predator in the shadows, is what made him terrifying. And yet, if you'd asked his coworkers back then, they probably would have described him as a man with grease-stained hands, Good with cars, maybe a little secretive, but nothing alarming. His wife might have told you he was distant at times, but not violent. His kids saw a dad who could fix their bike chains and bring home snacks. The mask worked, and it worked well. Every serial killer's story has a beginning, but Franklin's wasn't a fireworks display of horror. It was a slow burn, an accumulation of small red flags that nobody added together until much, much later. By the time anyone realized what he was capable of, the damage had already spread across decades. What makes this origin chilling isn't that it was extraordinary, it's that it was so ordinary. He wasn't the creepy stranger everyone avoided. He was the guy who borrowed jumper cables from his neighbor, the mechanic who knew which spark plug you needed, the army vet who blended back into civilian life without a fuss. The Grim Sleeper didn't start as a monster. He started as someone you'd barely notice. And maybe that's why it took so long to stop him. As we move into the next part of this story, remember that behind every nightmare headline is a beginning that often looks like nothing. That's the quiet danger of people like Lonnie Franklin Jr. They don't wear their shadows on their sleeves. They tuck them away, waiting for the night. By the time the mid-1980s rolled around, Los Angeles wasn't just a city, it was a battlefield. The crack epidemic was exploding, gangs were marking entire blocks as their territories, and the murder rate was climbing so fast that the LAPD could barely keep up with the paperwork. In South Central, life moved under the heavy weight of fear. Sirens were part of the daily soundtrack, and chalk outlines on the sidewalk became almost routine. It was in this chaos that Lonnie Franklin Jr. found his moment. The first known killings tied to him started in 1985. Young black women, often involved in sex work or struggling with addiction, began disappearing and turning up dead in alleyways, dumpsters, or abandoned buildings. Their deaths were brutal, marked by violence that suggested anger and control. To the public, they were just more victims in a city drowning in homicides. But for those who looked closer, the similarities were unsettling. The women had been attacked in nearly identical ways, with traces of sexual assault, and in some cases, Franklin's weapon of choice was a small caliber handgun. The neighborhoods where these women vanished were already written off by most of the city. Politicians called it the war zone. Reporters barely mentioned the victims by name, and even police officers sometimes treated the cases as nuisances rather than urgent investigations. That apathy gave Franklin an opening wider than any alley he prowled. When a system doesn't care about its most vulnerable, predators thrive, and Franklin knew that. He studied his environment, and he played it like a musician, hitting the same dark note over and over. He would drive through streets late at night, scanning for women alone, women who needed money, women who might take the risk of climbing into a stranger's car. Once they stepped in, the outcome was almost predetermined. They didn't know they were stepping into the orbit of a man who had already decided their fate. The LAPD did eventually take notice, though not in the way you'd expect. Detectives began to notice that several bodies were turning up with strikingly similar wounds, similar circumstances. A task force was quietly put together, but its resources were thin. After all, they were working in a city with hundreds of murders every year. Trying to convince the higher-ups that a serial killer was targeting women no one seemed to value was like trying to sell a ghost story at a stockbroker's meeting. Interest was low, patience was thin. Meanwhile, families of the victims were left with nothing but grief and silence. Mothers and sisters begged for answers, held vigils, demanded police action. For them, these weren't faceless statistics. These were daughters and sisters who had fallen into a dangerous cycle of poverty and drugs. Yes, but who were still human, still loved. Franklin's murders weren't just crimes against individuals. They were blows against an entire community already staggering under the weight of systemic neglect. One chilling pattern set Franklin apart: his habit of discarding bodies in plain sight. He wasn't burying his victims in remote deserts or hiding them in basements. He was leaving them in alleys, trash bins, and side streets, like yesterday's garbage. It was bold, even taunting, as though he knew the city would look away. And in a grim twist, he wasn't wrong. For years, his murders barely made headlines, drowned out by bigger stories of drug wars and celebrity scandals. Picture this: a woman's body discovered in the early morning hours, a blanket hastily covering her, police officers stepping carefully around the scene while the sun rises over palm trees and billboards. The crime scene tape flutters in the breeze. A few curious neighbors watch from their porches, and then just like that, it's over. The cleanup crew comes. The body is taken away, and the block goes back to its usual rhythm of kids riding bikes and cars, blasting music. Life resumes, even though something monstrous just happened. Franklin understood this rhythm. He understood that the city's indifference was his camouflage. Every time he killed, it was like rolling dice in a game he knew was rigged in his favor. He kept photos of women he met, sometimes alive, sometimes dead, stacking evidence of his own secret empire in his home. To him, they weren't victims. They were trophies, reminders of his power in a world that ignored the powerless. But here's the haunting part. Even when police suspected a serial killer, the urgency wasn't there. The community eventually started calling the murderer the Southside Slayer, though that name was tossed around for multiple suspects during that chaotic period. The confusion was so thick you could cut it with a butter knife. Imagine living in a neighborhood where you knew women were disappearing, where whispers of a killer floated around, and yet nobody seemed to know or care exactly who he was, or how many lives he had taken. In the middle of all this, Franklin's personal life carried on like nothing was wrong. He worked his mechanic jobs, attended family gatherings, and kept his mask firmly in place. His wife and children had no idea what he was doing when he stayed out late, cruising the streets. Friends thought he was just another guy trying to make ends meet in a tough city. Nobody looked at him and saw a predator. That normalcy was his shield. What makes the early murders particularly chilling is the sense of invisibility. The victims were invisible to the system, the crimes were invisible to the headlines, and Franklin himself was invisible in plain sight. That trifecta created a perfect storm. He was hunting in a city that refused to notice it was being hunted. The 1980s passed like that, bodies appearing, families mourning, the city moving on. Franklin's name never surfaced in connection with the crimes. He wasn't even on the radar. To the LAPD, he was just another face in the crowd. To the women he targeted, though, he was the last face they ever saw. And as the decade closed, Franklin had built the foundation of his dark legacy. He had learned how to kill and keep killing without being caught, how to use the city's neglect as a weapon, and how to maintain the facade of the man next door. But then something strange happened. After years of horror, the murders suddenly stopped. Or at least, it looked that way from the outside. When the 1990s arrived, something odd happened in Los Angeles. The bodies stopped turning up. At least, the ones tied to Franklin's pattern. For almost a decade, the string of killings seemed to vanish. To outsiders, it looked like the nightmare had passed. The police had other crises on their hands, gang wars at their peak, the crack epidemic still tearing through households, and a city rocked by racial tension and riots. Whatever task force had once been loosely watching for a serial predator in South Central, it was now buried under paperwork and political pressure. The story of the murdered women faded, like graffiti on a wall slowly washed away by rain. And yet, that's the reason Lonnie Franklin Jr. earned his infamous nickname, the Grim Sleeper. It was as though the killer had gone into hibernation, retreating into the shadows, letting the city's paranoia cool down before resurfacing. But here's the uncomfortable question: did he really stop? Or did the world just stop paying attention? There are theories. Some believe Franklin genuinely paused his killings, perhaps out of fear of getting caught as whispers about a serial killer floated around in the late 80s. Others suggest his family life might have tightened the leash raising children, maintaining appearances, keeping his mask glued in place. A darker theory insists that he didn't stop at all, but rather, his victims during those years were misclassified, ignored, or lost in the tidal wave of violence engulfing LA. When your city racks up over 1,000 homicides a year, who's counting carefully? It's chilling to think that his so-called sleep might not have been sleep at all, but simply invisibility perfected. Think about it. Franklin wasn't the kind of predator who hid women in basements or buried them in rural cornfields. He discarded his victims in alleys, dumpsters, side streets. If he did continue during the 1990s, maybe the LAPD brushed those bodies into piles of drug-related deaths or gang violence. Paperwork got filed, names were forgotten, and the killer kept moving under the radar. Meanwhile, Franklin's personal life gave no indication of the storm beneath. He was raising a family, working mechanic jobs, and occasionally taking city contracts fixing equipment. He even worked for the sanitation department for a while, picking up trash. Think about the irony of that. While the city thought of him as the guy cleaning up garbage, he was the one leaving behind human bodies like trash. He maintained that duality perfectly. To his kids, he was dad. To his wife, he was a husband who wasn't always affectionate but was present enough. To his neighbors, he was just another working man trying to make ends meet. That decade of silence wasn't just a break in the killings, it was part of Franklin's camouflage. Criminal profilers often talk about cooling off periods, times when a killer steps back, recharges, reassesses, and sometimes even reinvents their methods. Franklin's sleep did something more. It erased urgency. The city forgot. Detectives retired. Case files collected dust in boxes. Families who had lost daughters in the 1980s were left with cold grief and colder leads. Without new bodies, the idea of a serial killer dissolved into myth, a whisper of, "Remember back then?" at neighborhood cookouts. The nickname Grim Sleeper wasn't coined until much later, but even now it perfectly captures the unease of that gap, like a horror villain in a movie who disappears in the second act, only to lurch back onto the screen. Franklin's silence wasn't relief, it was suspense. He was pressing pause, not stop. What makes this silence even more disturbing is how ordinary Franklin's life appeared during those years. He went to car shows, fixed stereos, barbecued with friends. He took photos, always photos. Endless photos of women, many of whom were never identified. Some were smiling, some looked wary, some looked like they had no idea what kind of man was behind the camera. Those images became his private gallery, a hidden archive of a predator who never truly stopped hunting, even if his hands were idle for a while. Meanwhile, South Central was changing. The Rodney King beating in 1991 and the riots in 1992 left deep scars on the city. Trust in the police, which was already fragile, shattered completely. Entire neighborhoods erupted in flames, and the divide between law enforcement and residents became a canyon. If Franklin had killed during those years, do you really think the community believed the police would care? For many residents, the LAPD was as threatening as the gangs, if not more. The silence of the 1990s wasn't just Franklin's, it was the city's too. Nobody wanted to look too closely at the forgotten women who had disappeared. For nearly 14 years, Franklin's name never surfaced, not even as a blip. He lived in the same house on 81st Street, raising his family, hiding in plain sight. He wasn't some shadowy drifter. He was a fixture in the neighborhood, the kind of man you'd wave at from your front porch, never suspecting what he'd done years before. And maybe that's the scariest part. Evil doesn't always lurk far away. Sometimes it just takes a nap next door. Franklin didn't need to keep moving or hiding. His greatest disguise was staying exactly where he'd always been. But the thing about sleep is that it eventually ends. By the early 2000s, new bodies started turning up, echoing the same grim pattern of the 1980s. Same neighborhoods, same victim profile, same casual disposal in alleys and trash bins. For detectives who had been around long enough to remember the old files, it was like déjà vu. For families who had buried daughters in the 80s, it was like reopening a wound that had never healed. And for the city, it was a reminder that the nightmare had never truly gone away. The Grim Sleeper had only been biding his time, waiting for the world to forget before striking again. When the calendar flipped into the 2000s, Los Angeles had a different face, but the same old scars. The crime rate had dipped since the blood-soaked peak of the 1980s, but South Central was still struggling. Whole blocks bore the weathered look of neighborhoods left behind by prosperity. Franklin, who had been sleeping for years, stirred again. Bodies began appearing that carried a cruel familiarity, echoing the killings of the past. It was as if time itself had rewound. The victims were the same type Franklin had hunted before, mostly vulnerable black women, often entangled with drugs, sex work, or the rough edges of survival. Their lives made them easy targets, but what really made them vulnerable was how society viewed them. Franklin knew this and used it. He wasn't chasing headlines, he was chasing invisibility. By now, Franklin was in his late 40s, even early 50s. But his habits hadn't changed. He still cruised through the streets late at night, scanning for women who looked desperate enough to accept a ride. If the 1980s had taught him that law enforcement wasn't paying attention, the 2000s confirmed it. He was recycling his own crimes like a rerun of an old TV show, confident nobody would connect the dots. The LAPD, to their credit, eventually noticed. Detectives began to see unsettling similarities between the new murders and the unsolved ones from decades earlier. The bodies carried the same signatures, gunshot wounds from a small caliber weapon, traces of sexual assault, careless disposal in alleys and trash heaps. Old memories stirred among investigators who had been around long enough to remember the whispers of a South Side Slayer back in the 1980s. But now, the killer had a new nickname waiting for him, coined by reporters who loved the drama of it all: the Grim Sleeper. The name stuck not because it was flashy, but because it was true. For nearly 14 years, he had gone quiet. Then, like a horror movie villain, he reappeared. The eerie silence followed by sudden violence made him even more frightening. It was proof that predators don't always vanish. Sometimes they just wait. Meanwhile, in the community, fear began to spread again. Mothers warned their daughters, church groups whispered prayers, and activists demanded action. People in South Central had seen this movie before. They remembered the 80s, when their cries for help were ignored, when the deaths of their daughters and sisters were reduced to statistics on a clipboard. They didn't want to watch history repeat itself. One case in particular shook investigators. A woman survived an attack and lived to describe Franklin's methods. She spoke of being lured into his car, of his calculated coldness, of his violence. Her testimony hinted at just how many others might have climbed into that car and never come back. Survivors like her didn't just add pieces to the puzzle, they screamed that the puzzle was still being assembled, right under everyone's nose. The early 2000s killings weren't frequent enough to dominate headlines, but they were consistent enough to raise suspicions. For every victim that made it into the newspaper, there were dozens of families left in silence, their grief drowned out by the city's usual noise. But slowly, the pattern emerged. Detectives couldn't ignore that this was the same ghost from the past, awakened and hungry again. Think about the audacity. Franklin wasn't killing in secret basements or rural hideaways. He was leaving bodies on the streets of Los Angeles, visible, public, unashamed. It was almost as though he dared the city to notice, like a magician waving his hand in plain sight. And still, for years, he slipped right back into the crowd. What changed in the 2000s wasn't Franklin, it was technology. Forensic science was no longer stuck in the era of fingerprints and lucky tips. DNA testing was now a weapon investigators could wield. The crime scenes from the 1980s had left traces, tiny fragments of Franklin's presence that science back then couldn't decode. But now, those fragments had a voice. Slowly, quietly, the investigation began to shift. Imagine Franklin during this time. He's older, heavier, more weathered, but still prowling, still confident. By day, he's a neighbor fixing cars in his driveway, talking about the Lakers, helping his kids with errands. By night, he's still the man cruising through Florence and Western, his car rolling slow under the glow of streetlights, watching. He must have believed he was untouchable, that the silence of the 1990s had erased his sins. But science was about to catch up, and the Grim Sleeper had no idea that the walls were closing in. By 2007, a special task force had been assembled specifically to track him down. Detectives cross-referenced old cases with new ones, lining up crime scene photos side by side, noting the echoes that tied decades together. They gave him his name, they gave him his reputation, and they gave themselves a mission to finally bring down the man who had haunted Los Angeles for over 20 years. And in the meantime, Franklin kept killing. Maybe not every week, maybe not every month, but enough. Enough to remind the city that he was still out there, that sleep doesn't last forever, and that some nightmares come back when you least expect them. By the mid-2000s, the Grim Sleeper had turned from an urban whisper into a full-blown investigative obsession. Detectives were stacking case files like bricks, each one eerily echoing the last, and all roads pointed toward the same chilling truth. Whoever was behind these killings had been haunting Los Angeles for decades. The problem? They had no name, no face, just DNA. And that's where the story takes a sharp turn. Back in the 1980s, DNA testing was a science fiction dream. Investigators could collect biological samples, sure, but the technology to decode them wasn't there. By the 2000s, however, the game had changed. Crime scenes that had once yielded nothing more than frustration were now treasure troves of evidence waiting to be unlocked. The LAPD poured through old files, re-examining evidence that had been stored away in freezers and cardboard boxes. It was like opening a time capsule of violence, and buried inside was Franklin's DNA, waiting patiently, like a fingerprint from a ghost. The match was clear. The same DNA was showing up across multiple victims, stretching from the 1980s into the new millennium. It confirmed what investigators had long suspected: this wasn't just random violence. It was one man killing across decades, resurfacing after a mysterious gap. But here's the kicker. When they ran the DNA through the national database, it didn't match anyone. Whoever the Grim Sleeper was, he had managed to live an entire life without ever leaving his genetic signature in the system. That's when investigators decided to take a controversial gamble. Instead of looking for the killer directly, they turned to something called familial DNA testing. Think of it like searching for a relative instead of the exact suspect. If the killer's DNA didn't match anyone in the database, maybe one of his family members would. It was a radical move at the time, sparking endless debates about privacy, ethics, and how far police should go in hunting down suspects. But the detectives chasing the Grim Sleeper weren't chasing a petty thief. They were chasing a man who had slaughtered women for decades. And it worked. In 2010, the search lit up with a hit not on Franklin himself, but on his son, Christopher. Christopher had been arrested on a weapons charge, and his DNA was in the system. It wasn't an exact match to the killer's DNA, but it was close enough to scream family connection. Suddenly, investigators had their lead. The Grim Sleeper wasn't just a ghost anymore. He was someone's father, someone's neighbor, someone whose backyard barbecue smoke you might have smelled on a summer afternoon. Now came the hard part, proving it. Detectives had to connect the dots without tipping Franklin off. They tailed him discreetly, watched his routines, mapped his movements, and then came one of those "you can't make this up" moments. An undercover officer posed as a busboy at a pizza restaurant Franklin liked. When Franklin finished his meal and left behind a half-eaten slice, utensils, and a glass, the officer swooped in, bagging the leftovers like priceless artifacts. It sounds absurd, catching a killer with a dirty plate, but the DNA pulled from that pizza matched the crime scenes perfectly. The ghost now had a name: Lonnie David Franklin Jr. For detectives, it was both exhilarating and sobering. They had their man, but the realization of who he was, an ordinary-looking middle-aged guy living in South Central, a mechanic, a husband, a father, was chilling. Franklin wasn't hiding in the shadows of abandoned warehouses or lurking in desolate woods. He was living in plain sight, just like he always had. The investigation didn't stop at DNA. When police raided Franklin's home, they uncovered a gallery of horror, over 1,000 photographs, and hundreds of hours of videotape featuring women, many unidentified. Some appeared alive and smiling, others unconscious, and some possibly dead. It was a chilling catalog, part trophy collection, part voyeuristic obsession. Detectives stared at faces that would never leave their minds. Women frozen in time, some still missing, their fates unknown. For every photograph, there was the terrifying possibility of another victim, another unsolved case, buried under decades of neglect. Familial DNA had done what years of detective work couldn't. It had cracked the case wide open, and yet, the victory felt heavy. The evidence revealed the sheer scale of Franklin's predation. How many women had truly fallen into his hands? The official count was around 10, but those photographs hinted at far more. He may have been called the Grim Sleeper, but his collection suggested a man who never really stopped. Not in the 80s, not in the 90s, not ever. Think about the irony. Franklin had lived his entire life believing he was invisible, protected by the system's apathy and his own calculated normalcy. But in the end, it wasn't a dramatic chase, a confession, or a lucky eyewitness that caught him. It was science, a strand of DNA passed down to his son, and a discarded piece of pizza. After decades of silence, the Grim Sleeper's secret was finally out. And for the families who had waited years for justice, it was bittersweet. They finally had a name, finally had a man to point to, but nothing could bring back the women whose lives he had stolen. The investigation wasn't just about catching a killer, it was about acknowledging the pain of a community that had been ignored for too long. Franklin's arrest forced Los Angeles to look in the mirror and confront a brutal truth. The Grim Sleeper had thrived not just because he was cunning, but because the city hadn't cared enough to stop him. On July 7, 2010, the streets of South Central Los Angeles buzzed with the kind of gossip that spreads faster than wildfire. Police cars swarmed outside a modest home on 81st Street, Neighbors peered from behind curtains, and news crews rolled up to catch every second. After decades of whispers, after a trail of bodies that stretched from the Reagan years to the Obama presidency, the grim sleeper finally had a face. Lonnie David Franklin Jr., 67 years old, was led away in handcuffs. For the families of the victims, it was the arrest they'd been praying for. For his neighbors, it was a shockwave. Because here's the kicker: Franklin wasn't some recluse hiding in shadows. He was the guy who fixed cars on the block, who attended backyard barbecues, who laughed and chatted like anyone else. To see him hauled off as a suspected serial killer was like finding out your mailman had a dungeon. It didn't compute. Some neighbors swore it couldn't be true. Others quietly admitted the whole thing made sense, something about his watchful eyes, the way he prowled the streets at night, his obsession with photographing women. The trial didn't begin until years later, delayed by legal wrangling, backlogged courts, and the sheer volume of evidence. When it finally got underway in 2016, the courtroom was thick with anticipation. Victims' families filled the benches, clutching photos of daughters, sisters, and mothers, long gone. Prosecutors laid out the mountain of evidence: DNA linking Franklin to multiple victims, the infamous pizza slice, and the grotesque archive of photographs discovered in his home. It wasn't just a case, it was a reckoning. Franklin's defense tried to poke holes. They argued that the DNA evidence was circumstantial, that the photographs didn't prove murder, that the police had painted him as a monster before the trial even began. But the weight of the evidence crushed those arguments like paper. The prosecution's narrative was clear. Lonnie Franklin Jr. had hunted vulnerable women for decades, hiding behind the mask of an ordinary man. One of the most haunting moments came when survivors took the stand. Women who had escaped his grasp recounted how he lured them, how his demeanor shifted from casual to cold, how violence followed once they were trapped in his car or home. Their voices shook, but their stories were consistent, chilling echoes of what so many others had not survived. For jurors, it wasn't just about science. It was about hearing the living proof of Franklin's cruelty. The photographs presented during the trial deepened the horror. Investigators had uncovered around 10 images and videos, many depicting women in vulnerable or unconscious states. Some victims were identified, others remained mysteries. For the families sitting in court, the fear was palpable. Was their loved one one of the faces in Franklin's secret collection? Was she alive when the shutter clicked? Nobody could say for sure. The courtroom became not just a place of judgment, but of collective mourning. After months of testimony, the jury delivered its verdict: guilty on 10 counts of murder, 1 count of attempted murder, and 1 count of possession of a firearm. Each guilty verdict rang like a bell in that courtroom. Each one a small measure of justice for the years of silence. When the judge sentenced Franklin to death, families wept, some from relief, others from exhaustion. Justice had come late, almost insultingly late, but at least it had arrived. Yet, even with the verdict, questions lingered. What about the women in those photographs who were never identified? How many victims had truly been lost to Franklin's hands? The official tally of 10 felt like the tip of the iceberg. Detectives privately admitted they suspected the number was much higher. But with time, evidence, and memories lost to the decades, those questions would remain forever unanswered. Outside the courtroom, the case sparked fierce debates. The use of familial DNA testing, which had cracked the case, was hailed by some as groundbreaking and condemned by others as an invasion of privacy. Civil liberties groups warned of a slippery slope. If the government could use your relative's DNA to track you down, what else could they do? But for the families of the Grim Sleeper's victims, the ethics of the method paled compared to the relief of knowing the killer had been caught. Franklin himself remained mostly silent throughout the trial, showing little emotion as the walls closed in. Some described him as detached, others as quietly smug, as if the trial were an inconvenience rather than the climax of his life. He never confessed, never explained the long silence in the 1990s, never gave closure to the families desperate for answers. If they hoped for remorse, they didn't get it. The trial ended with Franklin on death row at San Quentin State Prison, a far cry from the quiet home he had once kept in South Central. For a man who had blended into his neighborhood for decades, invisibility was no longer an option. His name was in every headline, his face plastered across television screens. The Grim Sleeper was no longer a shadow, he was flesh, blood, and a prisoner awaiting execution. But, in a final twist, Franklin never faced the needle. In March 2020, he was found dead in his cell, unresponsive, at the age of 67. The cause was never publicly disclosed in detail, though foul play was ruled out. Just like that, the story ended not with an execution, but with a quiet death behind bars. For some families, it was a bitter disappointment. They wanted to see him formally held accountable until his last breath. For others, his passing was enough. The nightmare was finally over, even if the ending felt anticlimactic. Still, the trial and Franklin's death left behind something bigger than just a headline. It forced Los Angeles to reckon with decades of neglect, to face the uncomfortable truth that entire groups of victims had been ignored because of who they were. Franklin thrived in the blind spots of a city that didn't value its most vulnerable, and the justice system had to live with that shame. When the cell door clanged shut for the last time on Lonnie David Franklin Jr., Los Angeles was left with more than just a closed case file. The story of the Grim Sleeper didn't fade quietly into the archives. It rippled outward, forcing uncomfortable conversations, reshaping policy, and leaving scars on a city that had already been stitched together with too many of them. For many families, the verdict and Franklin's eventual death behind bars didn't erase decades of pain. Mothers who had waited years for police updates still woke up at night, staring at photographs of daughters who never came home. Some families clutched onto the hope that the mystery faces in Franklin's secret collection might one day be identified, giving names and dignity back to women who had been reduced to evidence numbers. Others found themselves trapped in cycles of, what if? What if the police had acted sooner? What if the city had cared more when the first bodies were discovered? Justice arrived, but too late to rewrite the past. At the community level, the case exposed a devastating fracture. For years, residents in South Central had known that women were disappearing, that something sinister was prowling their neighborhoods. But when they called for help, the response was sluggish, dismissive, sometimes non-existent. The narrative that Franklin's victims were drug users, sex workers, or not credible witnesses didn't just shape police priorities. It silenced entire communities. The Grim Sleeper thrived in that silence, shielded by prejudice and bureaucratic neglect. After his arrest, city leaders made promises about reform, about listening, about valuing all lives equally. Some progress was made, but for many, the damage had already been done. Law enforcement agencies, too, had to face the mirror. The use of familial DNA to identify Franklin was hailed as a breakthrough that could revolutionize crime solving. It was a tool that pierced through decades of dead ends, giving detectives a path forward when every other lead had crumbled. But it also raised thorny ethical questions. Was it fair to drag someone into an investigation simply because a relative had left DNA in a government database? Where was the line between solving crimes and violating privacy? The Grim Sleeper case became a reference point in every debate about genetics, policing, and civil liberties. It showed both the power of science and the complexity of wielding it responsibly. And yet, for all the high-tech breakthroughs, what haunted people most wasn't the science. It was the sheer normalcy of Franklin's life. Neighbors remembered him as the man who waved from his driveway, who fixed cars, who attended cookouts. He didn't fit the cartoonish image of a predator lurking in the shadows. That was the real terror, that evil can look ordinary, that the man grilling burgers 2 houses down might be hiding horrors no one could imagine. Franklin's mask of normalcy forced people to rethink how they understand danger, how much we really know about the people around us. As the years passed, documentaries, books, and podcasts revisited the case. Each retelling brought new perspectives: the systemic racism that allowed the killings to be ignored, the resilience of families who refused to stop demanding justice, the survivors who spoke up even when no one wanted to listen. The Grim Sleeper wasn't just a story about a serial killer. It was a story about a city failing its own people, and the cost of silence. Even now, questions linger. How many victims did Franklin really have? The official count was 10 murders, but investigators admitted the number could easily be much higher. What happened during his so-called sleep in the 1990s? Did he really stop killing? Or did his crimes simply go unnoticed? Without his confession, those questions remain unanswered, sealed in the silence he carried to his grave. The legacy of the case lies in the lessons it forced Los Angeles to confront: that when victims are poor, black, or marginalized, society too often looks away. That justice delayed isn't just an inconvenience, it's a betrayal. that monsters don't always live in shadows. Sometimes they wave from the porch across the street, and maybe that's why the Grim Sleeper still lingers in people's minds. Not because of the grisly details, but because of what he revealed about us, the blind spots, the failures, and the uneasy truth that safety isn't always guaranteed, even in the places we feel most at home. So, as the story winds down, imagine the city at night, the hum of traffic, the glow of streetlights, the quiet rhythm of neighborhoods carrying on with their lives. Somewhere in that darkness, a predator once walked unnoticed for decades. He's gone now, but the silence he exploited still whispers a warning. Pay attention, because evil doesn't announce itself. The Grim Sleeper story is one that doesn't end neatly, and maybe that's fitting. It lingers in the spaces between justice and injustice, between memory and forgetting. It's a story that reminds us of how fragile the balance is between ordinary life and hidden nightmare. We've reached the end of tonight's story, and as we drift slowly out of its shadows, it's worth holding on to the final image. The Grim Sleeper wasn't just one man. He was also a reflection of the gaps in our systems, the cracks where lives were lost, and the silence that let violence thrive. Franklin lived like any other neighbor, ordinary and unremarkable, and that ordinariness was the mask that allowed him to keep going, year after year. But behind that mask was devastation. Families lost daughters, sisters, and mothers, and for too long their grief was ignored. Justice arrived, but only after decades of waiting, after the silence had done its damage. That truth is heavier than any single verdict. It lingers like a shadow even now, reminding us that justice delayed is more than a cliché. It's a wound that never fully closes. And yet, even with that weight, there is a quiet resilience in this story. The families who kept speaking when no one listened, the communities who refused to let the memory of their loved ones fade, the breakthroughs in science that pushed the case forward, all of these threads stitch together something stronger than the horror. They remind us that silence can be broken, that the unseen can be brought into the light. So as you let the story settle in your mind, soften the edges of it. Let the harsh lights of the courtroom fade. Let the sharp sound of verdicts blur, until what remains is only a soft whisper. Pay attention, value every life, and never underestimate the masks people wear. Now, rest easy. The story is over, the voices are quieter, and the night has grown calm again. End of script. Have a good night's sleep, and sweet dreams.